Hello guys, Sakura Diesel here. And you know what? You guys have been staring at the same boring blank of a screen for almost all of my videos. Sure, you may have seen my face in some video clips here and there, but you've mostly been staring at this the whole entire time. And I feel bad for you guys. Well, I think it's time we change that for a bit. That's a bit better. Now, I'll admit, this is probably not as much, but it'll have to do for now. And hey, having an avatar is better than having no avatar, right? Anyway, hello, this is Sakura Diesel, and welcome to my 100th episode. Wow, it's been almost 3 years since I started this, and now I'm finally at 100. That's really something. Before we start, I'd like to thank my subscribers and my viewers for making this possible. Now, I'll admit, I may not be the best video or editing maker out there, but I could say I've gotten a bit better ever since I've started this. And I've been trying new things, whether for the good or the bad. But for the most part, I've been having fun doing this stick. So you're probably wondering what I'm going to do for this 100th episode. Well, I've thought about it, and now I know what I want to do for it. Back when I first started, I've been making My Little Pony and Thomas the Tank Engine reviews. And boy, did they suck. Now, the ponies ones, there were some I thought I did okay, and some I didn't feel like I didn't do so hot. But early Thomas stuff was really bad for me. Seriously, go watch some of those videos and you'll see what I mean. I wasn't really given any clear details to some of these reviews, and I thought I could have done a better job. And that's just what I'm going to do today. But instead of reviewing the whole show like I did in my old videos, I'm going to be reviewing every season and every special of Thomas. That's right, folks. We're going to take a look at every season and every special of the show, whether the good or the bad. First off, some may say that I'm ripping off Pie Guy's SpongeBob reviews, when really I'm not. There are going to be some stuff that will be different from mine and his. And please don't freak out about this. People have done stuff like this before, Pie Guys. Now, with that out of the way, let me tell you how this is going to work. First, I'm going to watch all the episodes of each season, as well as the whole special. Then, I'm going to go over the episode by saying what I like and didn't like about each episode. And each episode is going to get its own rating. If an episode gets an 8, 9, or 10, then it means it was a good or great episode. If it gets a 6 or a 7, then it means it was good, but it has some weak or questionable moments. A 5 or a 4, then it was an okay episode with a good story, but leaving to no impact on me, or the setting was good and the characters were good, but the story was weak. Finally, an episode that gets a 3 or below is the bad episode, with no good story, characters, and morals. Then, at the end, I'll give my final thought on the season as a whole. What were some good parts, and what were some weak parts? Also, all of these are my own opinion. It does not mean that the episodes or seasons were good or bad by default. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. And if you think that a season or an episode was good or bad, then please tell me why. Also, all of these episodes that I'm reviewing are the UK episodes. I might go over some changes that the US made, but it not might be that much, since most of the stuff they did change was the dialogue of the engines. So, with that, let's get started, shall we? Episode 1, Thomas and Gordon. Gordon pays Thomas out after teasing him. So this is the first episode where we get to see Thomas and Gordon for the first time, as well as a brief cameo of Henry, James, and Annie and Clarabel. The setting of Knapford Station looks great, and the rest of the island of Sodor is beautiful to look at as well. But I'll get into more on that later. I like that we get to see Thomas as his normal, cheeky self, but it does lead to a very nice little payback, and it does lead to a good moral, about be careful on how you play your jokes and to whom. The theme and the background music is great as well. I love Gordon's theme when he's pulling the express. It's just awesome. Though there are some things to nitpick about. For one thing, why is James there? I know the show was in its earlier stage, and I am thankful that he doesn't speak yet, but I'm sure they could have used Edward for the scene because he's already there on Sodor. Also, in the restored version, you'll notice some scenes where you can really tell where the sets are. Again, these are just nitpicks, and and it doesn't hold back for me to give this episode a 9 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 2, Edward and Gordon. Edward helps Gordon up a hill. I've always found it interesting that the first ever book of the Railway series is the second episode, which makes you wonder, what would happen if the show started off with Edward instead of Thomas? Another thing that interests me is that this is the first few episodes where two stories are combined into one episode, this one being Edward's Day Out, and this episode's title. I think they did it as a pretty good move, because both of them are really short, and plus we already know who Gordon is, and it does tie into the episode nicely. Also, I noticed that this is the only season where all the trucks have the same facial expressions. Again, there are some things to nitpick. It's obvious that Thomas is not bigger than Edward, but I can kinda let it slide. Also, you'll still see a piece of a set on Gordon's hill. But again, these are just nitpicks, and I give this episode a 10 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 3, The Sad Story of Henry. Henry refuses to come out of the tunnel because of the rain, and he gets picked up for that. So this is the first episode where we see Henry and Sir Topham Hatt, and I really like how this plays out. Some may argue that this episode started the 3 strikes and you're out plot, but it works here because 1, the episode is 5 minutes, so the strike doesn't feel forced. Second, the strikes had a purpose. Henry wouldn't come out of the tunnel, so they tried different ways. Now that's more believable and understandable. And 3, Henry deserved what he got. Now he doesn't stay bricked up forever, but the punishment is understandable. We've all had experiences like this, either because we were too stubborn or afraid or both to do something, and we got in trouble for it. Now it is strange that Thomas is the one that pushed Henry out of the tunnel, or tries. I know they could have used James or something, but I'm sure the fans would complain even more. But overall, this episode gets a 9 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 4, Edward, Gordon, and Henry. Henry comes out of the tunnel after Gordon breaks down, and Edward can't push the train. So this episode has some good moments, like Henry learning his lesson, and now he's free from the tunnel. And it's cool to see 5 coaches in the express. And it's also funny to see Gordon fail. But this episode had some problems too. 1, why is Edward at Nafford Station? Shouldn't he be in the sheds or shunting some trucks or something? Also, why would he push the train? Isn't that a bit dangerous? What if an engine was on the same track and they didn't see it coming? Stuff like that is really more noticeable when you watch it again and think about it more. But other than that, I'm still giving this an 8 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 5, Thomas's Train. Thomas pulls some coaches for the first time. Now we're starting to go back to the Thomas episodes, and this one is one of my favorites because I can actually relate to Thomas here. Not just me, but I think we've all been there before, when we leave something behind and it takes us a long time to realize it. Oh, the awkwardness. Which makes it more funny, but you also feel sorry for Thomas, and he does learn his lesson from it. I also like that we get to see some character development from Thomas. You really do feel his anger, and you're happy for him when he does pull his first train. Although I wonder why the coach in the front is the brake coach. But what do I know? So I give this episode a 10 out of 10. Great episode. Episode 6, Thomas and the Trucks. Thomas pulls some trucks. This is another fun episode. I love how we get a bit of a tour around Sodor while Thomas pulls the trucks. And I also love the theme they put as well. It's so catchy it'll get stuck in your head. I remember when I was a kid, I thought there were 2 different types of trucks. The ones in this episode, and the ones in the later seasons. But then I found out that the trucks' faces were only in this season. But I thought they looked great. I love the runaway as well. It's fast and it's actually intense. When you read the Railway series version, you kind of get this picture in your head. So this gets a 10 out of 10. Another great episode. Episode 7, Thomas and the Breakdown Train. Thomas saves James with the breakdown train. I really like the sparks they put on James's brake blocks. It looks real and very creative. And I'm glad they didn't say that James was a new engine because, as I said before, he was already on Sodor. So saying he was a new engine would be confusing. I also like that we get a major character development from Thomas. After the last episode, it shows that he's come a long way, and seeing him get his branch line is very heartwarming, and you feel really happy for him. Also, the music when they lifting James, epic. So I'm giving this a 10 out of 10. Another great episode. Episode 6, James and the Coaches. James is having trouble with some coaches. This episode, although I do think it's a good episode, it's not an episode that I would be watching again and again. I've heard that the third Railway Series book, James the Red Engine, was the Reverend W. Aldrich's least favorite book, and it's easy to see why. The first two stories does seem to drag, and putting them together, while it was a pretty smart move, didn't help in the fact that it still seemed a bit dull. The first half felt like it dragged on a bit, and the second half felt a bit rushed. It's easy to see them as a two-story. I think the combined story worked better in Edward and Gordon, because the first story is so short that it would be impossible to drag it out for 5 minutes, and it did fit in nicely and felt like a one story. Also, why are James and Edward traveling on Thomas's branch line? Another thing is that there seems to be a few passengers compared to the length on James's train. Come on, there's got to be more than that. But despite these nitpicks, it is nice to see a double header in the train, and we are introduced to James's character, and you do feel sorry for him. So to be fair, I'll give this a 7 out of 10. A good episode, but again, it's not one that I'll be watching again. Episode 9, Troublesome Trucks. James is given another chance by pulling trucks. Now this is a better episode than the last one. Right off the bat, you really do feel sorry for James, and it's very rare to see an engine cry. But once you see him trying to pull the trucks, you're really cheering for him, and he's trying so hard that after all that hard work, he gets to keep his red coat, which is very rewarding for him. Although, again, there are at least 3 things that does bug me about the episode. 1, when James's truck snaps, we see 5 rolling downhill. Now, in the next scene, we've seen 4. What the heck? You can't even count how many trucks were snapped? Also, what train was Sir Topham Hatt on? There was no coaches on Edward, unless they forgot to put them there. Finally, this one's a nitpick, but why is Edward pulling 2 trucks when in the station? The first 2 really does bother me, but even with these nitpicks, I'm still giving this a 9 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 10, James and the Express. James gets to pull the coaches for the first time. Much like Thomas in the breakdown train, this episode gives us a nice happy ending for James. Although he's learned his lesson, he still has a lot to learn, and with Gordon being his usual self, it was only a matter of time before James can prove himself as a really useful engine. Once again, the music is perfect, and I love James's theme, and again, I love getting a tour around Sodor. Though I have to ask, if Gordon was switched onto the loop line, shouldn't he have come back to the station the other way? Well, regardless, this is still a nice ending for James, and it deserves an 8 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 11, Thomas and the Guard. Thomas accidentally leaves the guard behind. So now we were introduced to Thomas's branch line, and you guys already know how I like that they gave us a tour around Sodor, so the place looks really nice. Also, I like how we're giving more information about Annie and Clarabel, and how much Thomas loves them, and they love Thomas. Also, this is one of the reasons why the U.S. lines makes more sense than the original. In the original, after Thomas leaves the guard behind, and he chases after him, the line was,
"I'm very sorry, Mr. Guard," said Thomas. "It wasn't your fault, Thomas," he replied.
Now that doesn't make any sense, because in the Railway Series, the guard fell flat on his face because he tripped over an old lady's umbrella. So you can make the argument that it wasn't Thomas's fault, but Thomas started so quickly and the guard didn't trip on anything, so technically this is Thomas's fault. In the U.S., the line is changed too.
"I am very sorry," said Thomas. "We all make mistakes," replied the conductor.
Now that makes much more sense, but even with that, I'm still giving this episode an 8 out of 10. Good episode. Episode 12. Thomas goes fishing. Thomas, well, goes fishing. Man, this episode. Whenever people talk about Thomas, this is one of these episodes that comes into most people's mind. And with good reason. First off, this episode, of course, started the old face meme. which if you listen to it and how they started, is actually pretty funny.
Inspector, he whispered, can you see fish?
Priceless. Also, the main plot may sound stupid, but this is actually pretty good. Thomas wants to go fishing. Well, that can't happen because, as they said, engines don't go fishing, and he doesn't get it. People are sometimes like that. They want to do something, but people said no, and they don't get it. And once they try it, they now understand what they mean. And that's just what happened to Thomas here, and he does learn his lesson. So yep, I say this episode gets a 9 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 13, Thomas, Terence, and the Snow. Thomas gets stuck in the snow, and Terence has to save him. So I'm not really sure how to feel about this episode. I liked it as a kid, but now it seems kind of eh. It's not bad, but it's nothing really that special. I did like the snow. It looked nice, and it had a winter feel to it. And I really do like the design of Thomas's snowplow. But the one thing I didn't care for was Terence. Now, I'm not blaming the TV series, because he wasn't really used that much in the Railway series, but I think he had more of a character to him in the Railway series than he did here. He doesn't really have that much of a character to him. He's just a tractor that likes to plow fields. That's it. I mean, at least with the other engines and road vehicles, we have more of a character to them. Terence is nothing more than just a tractor that likes to plow, and he always has that smile on his face. I don't know, but to be fair, I'll give this episode a 6 out of 10. Good episode, but not one of my favorites. Episode 14, Thomas and Bertie. Thomas and Bertie have a race. This episode is a lot of fun, and the plot is just so simple. Thomas and Bertie race around Thomas's branch line. But you know what? That's what makes this really entertaining. This is a perfect example where you can have a simple story and still make it entertaining. We already got the fun and creative story from the Railway series. Now just put some models and you're good to go. Just seeing Thomas and Bertie race and having fun time is just great. There's nothing else for me to say, so you know what this episode is getting. 10 out of 10. A very great episode. Episode 15, Tenders and Turntables. Gordon and James are having trouble with the turntable. I remember this episode as a kid, but I don't remember that much about it. I like the idea on how life on the main line is different now that Thomas has his branch line. And it does show how much they missed him, and how much they need him as well. I also like how Ringo Starr explains the uses of a turntable. Kids would probably be a little confused, but they still might know what he's talking about. And some jokes with James and Gordon with the turntable is pretty funny. The only complaint I have about this episode is that we don't get much of an explanation on why Henry wants to go on strike. I mean, we get the idea in the Railway series, but that story won't come later till season 4, which I think that story should have been first, and this episode should have been the next episode. But even with that, I'll still give this a 7 out of 10. A good episode, but again, not one of my favorites. Episode 16, Trouble in the Sheds. The tender engines are going on strike. So picking up the last episode, we get to see how much the tender engines think they're being treated unfairly. I like that in the beginning we get a zoom in on Sir Topham's office and the inside of it. This is also the first episode that we get to see Percy, and he's a pretty likable character. Much like Thomas, he's cheeky, but his childlike innocence just fits right in with him. Though it is strange to see the engines covered up in tarp. You only do that when you want to reveal a new project to your boss or your people at work. But judging by the shapes, it's very clear that we would have seen the original characters just without tenders. But either way, this episode gets a 7 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 17, Percy runs away. Percy runs backwards and can't stop. Remember what I said before about Percy being like a little kid? Well, this episode is a perfect example of that. Much like a little kid, he gets scared and sometimes doesn't know any better, but he does learn his lesson sometimes. And I like the ending where Ringo said that Percy is still cheeky because he has that sort of engine. Meaning he knows his lesson, but that doesn't mean he's going to stop being cheeky. Also, Mike and Jr. really know how to come up with really good music for the show. I like the Runaway theme. It's just really awesome and it fits really well with Gordon almost crashing into Percy. It's actually scary and intense. So yep, this episode gets an 8 out of 10. Good episode. Episode 18, Coal. Henry needs special coal. This episode and the next one after it is one of my favorites. Again, Micah Jr. really know how to give the right music for each scene of the episodes. I really like how they handle Henry's character in this. You really do feel sad and sorry for him. He wants to be really useful, but there's something that's troubling him. Imagine if this was a kid or an old person or anyone wanting to work, but they can't because they're always sick or something worse. Of course, when he does feel better, you're all the more happy for him. And I like Thomas' expressions after Henry left the station. So yep, this episode gets a 10 out of 10. A great episode. Episode 19, The Flying Kipper. Henry has to take the Flying Kipper for the night. Man, oh man, this episode. This is another episode that people think of when they think of Thomas, and it's easy to see why. First off, this is the first ever episode that takes place at night. Sure, there's been episodes where there was nighttime, but this is the first time where the majority of the episode takes place at night, and it looks beautiful. Plus the music. I love it every time I hear it. It just feels like I'm going on an adventure. It's just awesome. Also, this does provide a nice happy ending for Henry, which does lead into a problem that later seasons would have, but we'll get to those later. Also, the crash, while parts of it look fake, it's still irresistible to see. You know what this episode is getting, and there's no denying it. 10 out of 10. Great episode. Episode 20, Whistles and Sneezes. Gordon can't control his whistle, and the boys throw stones at Henry. So this is the last episode for this season that's a two-story combined into one episode, and I think this one works well. Much like Edward and Gordon, both stories don't feel rushed or dragged on, and it does flow nicely. I love the new face they made for Henry when he is about to sneeze, and I like the little stop motion too. It's also very clear that when Gordon gets jealous, he gets jealous, but it makes it even more funny when he gets his comeuppance. I also like how they move the hammer when the workers are fixing this whistle. And this is also a great example that even though Percy is cheeky, he still cares and respects for the big engines, which is great. I give this episode a 9 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 21, Toby and the Stout Gentleman. Toby meets the Stout Gentleman for the first time. I like how we get to take a break from the main line and focus on a different part of the railway. And I also like that we only get to see Toby and not the other engines. Although there are some parts where the line is from Thomas's branch, but it's not that big a deal. And I really like Toby. You really do feel sorry for him when his line is about to be closed. But of course, as Ringo stated, that there will be a happy ending for the story. Although I didn't like how they already told you that the Stout Gentleman was Sir Topham Hatt. I mean, some kids would notice, but it kind of ruins the next episode a bit. But we'll get to that soon. But as for this episode, I'll still give it an 8 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 22, Thomas in Trouble. Thomas gets in trouble with the police. Now, this is what I mean about why I think it's a bad idea that they mentioned Sir Topham Hatt was the Stout Gentleman. When you want to reveal something big, you don't want to flat out reveal it right away and then say the exact same thing in the next episode, because it ruins the surprise. You can have a small hint or make us guess, but you don't want to flat out and say it right away, and the book got this right. When Sir Topham Hatt stated that he met Toby on holiday, it doesn't come off that surprising because we already know this from previous episode. And sure, you can argue that people have already read the book, so they would know who the Stout Gentleman is. But there are some kids who haven't read the books, so by revealing something like that when we already know from the last episode comes off as a bit of a letdown. Also, why is Thomas bringing Annie and Clarabel to the quarry? I know he loves them and all, but unless he's taking some workmen to the quarry, then there's no reason why he should take them with. Now, with that out of the way, there are some positives I have with the episode. This does bring a nice happy ending for Toby, and I like the joke with the police. And I also love the line that Thomas says.
To Thomas, "Where's your cow catcher?" he asked. "But I don't catch cows, sir."
Hilarious. So even though that there's still a big problem with the episode, I'm still giving it a 7 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 23, Dirty Objects. James gets into trouble with the trucks. Well, we get the runaway music, and the runaway is pretty good here. Though I do have to wonder why the tar wagons were left in the middle of the track. Shouldn't they be on a siding or something? I also like the continuity here in this episode, with James in the bootlace and the Troublesome Trucks as well. And I like seeing James in sticky tar for some reason. Not much to say on this, so 7 out of 10. A good episode. Episode 24, Off the Rails. Gordon fell in a ditch. Once again, we get an episode that has some callback to previous episodes, though I wonder how Percy knew about the burst safety valve incident, unless Henry told him. I also like the shut eyes they made for Gordon, although this episode is not really all that special to me, though I do like the song the boys sang, and you do feel sorry for Gordon at the end. But my main problem with this episode is that the turntable just stops in the middle of the ditch. It seems too obvious, and yeah, I know the show was just starting, but they could have made Gordon move while the turntable was turning. I'll give this episode a 7 out of 10. Good, but not that great. Episode 25, Down the Mine. Thomas falls down the mine. So picking up after the last episode, which is interesting because the second story won't come into play until after Season 3, but I'll get into that later. We see Thomas being his usual cheeky self to Gordon, but much like Thomas and Gordon, he soon eats his own words. I like the setting for the mine. It looks cool, though I have to ask, why is there a hole dug at the bottom of the track? I'm pretty sure with a hole like that, it wouldn't really hold up the trucks that much, but again, early steps. Again, the breakdown theme here is great, and it's interesting that in the ending, Thomas and Gordon form an alliance. But again, it won't come into play till Season 4, which makes you wonder, what would happen if Pink Pots and Queens were the final episode instead of the next one? I will also get into that episode later. But as for this episode, I'm giving it a 7 out of 10, a good episode. Episode 26, Thomas's Christmas Party. Thomas holds a Christmas party for Mrs. Kindly after she saved him from an accident. Now I have read the book that this episode is based on, and the book is a lot more better. I still like this episode, though it's weird seeing this as a final episode. This episode feels like a nice little thank you to the viewers who stuck around and watched Thomas from the very beginning. That's a little nice, but then again, Pink Pots and Queens had the same thing. So they could have used that for the final episode, or Mrs. Kindly's Christmas, which the episode was just a flashback, which I admit was nice. I also like that Thomas is being a bit more mature when it comes to snow, and I like the Santa hats they have on too, and I like the songs at the end. So while it does have some questionable moments, it is a nice little thank you note from the viewers, and a nice Christmas special. So I'll give this a 7 out of 10, a good episode. And that was every episode of Season 1 of Thomas and Friends. Boy, that took a bit long, didn't it? Before we get into the season overall, let's talk about some other things in this season. First, let's take a look at the episode counter. As you can see, Season 1 had 26 good episodes, 0 meh episodes, and 0 bad episodes. Even the episodes that had questionable moments and honestly weren't really all that special still had something good in it, mostly because they were based on the Railway series, but they still had something good and memorable in it. So I say Season 1 had a pretty good list of episodes. If you want to know my top 5 favorite episodes from Season 1, here it is. Number 5, Thomas's Train. Fun little story with something that does happen to a lot of people. Number 4, Edward and Gordon. A nice episode with 2 stories combined into one, and a nice introduction to Edward. Number 3, The Flying Kipper. Good music and beautiful night settings. Number 2, Cold. A good story that makes you feel really sorry for Henry. And number 1, Thomas and Bertie. A nice simple story, but really fun. Now let's talk about the characters. Each of the characters are really likable and each have different personalities. Most of these engines seem so real as if they were a person and not just trains. And that's another reason why this show is good. It really does feel like you can visit this place and you can have a good, normal conversation with any one of these characters. The Reverend Audrey always stated that his characters are like children, and he's really right. but you don't make them like brats or make them annoying. Sure, they act like children, but it's real emotions that they have to make them seem more childlike. Like take Thomas, for example. Thomas started out as an engine who would shunt coaches for the big engines and would tease them sometimes. But as time went on, he wanted to do something more, so he tried it with coaches and trucks. But it didn't work out because he didn't know what he was doing. But after some practice and learning more and more, he now has his own branch line and is very proud of it. That's some character development right there. And there are other characters that sort of get the same treatment, but we'll get to those in the other seasons. So I'd say the characters were really great in this season. Now, of course, you can't have great story or characters without great music. And do I really need to explain why these two are awesome? I did a top 10 best Thomas themes on them. Mike and Junior are really good music composers. Each of their music fits really nicely to each scene, and it doesn't feel like they're misplaced or they don't belong there. Of course, their Thomas theme is so catchy, and the other engines' themes are catchy and memorable as well. I can't really pick a favorite engine theme, because they're all so good. But if I did have to choose, I would go with Gordon, Edward, James, Toby, Henry, and Percy. But again, it's hard for me to choose, because they're each so original and memorable. I really got nothing to complain on their music for this season. So let's move on to the directing and sets. Here's how we're going to do this. We're going to talk about the sets first, then we'll talk about the models of the engines, and then we'll talk about the directing as a whole. So let's talk about the sets first. Now, I remember when I was a kid, anyone that didn't like Thomas always had the same reason for that: the engine's mouths don't move. And I can kind of see why people might not like that. But after reading the Railway series, I thought it was a clever idea. And while their mouths don't move, they still give them different facial features. Plus, the sets they use makes it look like a real railway. It's like I can actually visit this place. The stations are nothing special. They're just like any other stations from a real railway. Bafford looks nice, but from what I understand, it's supposed to be an end-of-the-line station. And minus the middle part, there are no buffers to interact that is the end of the line. The only station that I remember where it was the end of the line was the special station in Season 5. Well, there was also the station from the castle in King of the Railway, but other than those, I can't think of any other stations that's the end of the line. But as for the rest of the layout, it looks nice. My favorite place is Toby's line. I like the countryside, and seeing it brings back memories. Plus, it's also nice to see another place that's technically not a part of Sodor. Now let's talk about the models. Now I'm going to judge them based on their Season 1 model to the Railway series and their real-life counterparts. So from the pictures I found, you can see that in real life, Thomas didn't really have that much extra in the front. And in both real life and the Railway series, his funnel is a bit small than in the TV series, and his boiler looks a bit short too. And in the Railway series, the whistles are a bit closer together, where in the TV series, it looks a bit apart from each other. They got the footplate down good, and the cabin bunker looks nice. So I think the TV series came a bit close to the Railway series and the real engine counterpart. Next is Edward. Now you can clearly tell that Edward is a lot different from real life to both the Railway series and the TV series. The Reverend Audrey stated that Edward is based on a sharp Stenwood larger Seagull locomotive. For one thing, the cab is a bit more curved in the front, and the tender is a bit small too, to match with the cab. But what's also interesting that in the first illustration of the 3 railway engines, Edward looks a lot like his real-life counterpart. I don't know why the Rev or the illustrator wanted to change it, probably because it looked too much like a toy train. Also, the wheels aren't really that close together in the Railway series and in the TV series. They got the pistons down nicely, but in the TV series its tender, in terms of width, is a bit smaller than in the Railway series. I got nothing else to say, so Edward looks okay. Up next, we got Henry. Henry's engine is based off 5 MTs, and you can see that the Railway series got the new shape down nicely. The footplate is just about right, with the same triangular shapes in the front. The front wheel is placed between the pistons and the other wheels, and the tender is just where it needs to be. The TV series is nothing like this at all. The footplate just feels like a step added in, and it's not much down like in real-life counterpart, and the tender is in the wrong place. The only thing that got was the front and the wheel is still in front of the pistons. Everything else does not look right. Though I'm not going to be too harsh with this, it does bother me a bit. Now we got the fastest engine Gordon. Much like Henry, Gordon's TV series version is a bit different than both in his real life and railway series. They got the footplate down nicely, though I'm not sure why in both railway series and TV series his buffers are square-shaped, but I'm not going to judge on that. Also, in the early drawings, Gordon's tender looks a bit same in his real-life counterpart, but much like Edward, his tender is a bit different. And they got the tender down good, though in both railway and TV series, the front wheels are a bit too close together. But overall, Gordon looks good. The brightest red engine, James, is next. Now, James, I think both the railway series and TV series got down real good. His shape is the exact same size, and the cab is perfect. But again, in the TV series, his tender is just about the same as Edward's, Henry's, and Gordon's, looking a bit too small than in the railway series and its real-life counterpart. But overall, they got it down real good. I really got no complaints other than that. Up next is the cheeky engine Percy. Now, there's something about Percy that really bugs me. Now, it's not the TV version. TV version I could understand because they were trying to base off the early illustrated in the railway series, but it's the railway series. If you remember, in my history on Thomas the Tank Engine Part 1, I mentioned that the Reverend and Davely didn't get along very well, and the straw that broke the Reverend's back was the illustrations on Percy, saying he looked like a green caterpillar with red stripes. Now, I understand why the Reverend was mad at him for it, but if that was the case, why didn't he tell John to change Percy's design and make him the way he wanted it to, or made him look like his real-life counterpart? In fact, in one of the stories from Tramway Engines, he looks exactly like his real-life counterpart, minus the cab. But then after that, he goes back to his regular shape. What the heck? And you might say, well, maybe it's just from the one book. But take a look at Ghost Train. We clearly see that he is in his original shape. And this is from the same book, too. Then he goes back to normal. I don't know why this is bugging me, but it really is. I'm not sure if this is what the Reverend wanted, or the publishers wanted, or if this is what Gov and Peter wanted it, but they already had a shape for Percy, and they stuck with it before and after the story. Like I said, I'm not blaming the TV series, and they did get the original down pretty good, so the model is pretty good for the most part. Next is the good old tram engine Toby. Much like James, Toby is perfect in both railway and TV series. They got the cowcatchers down good, and they got the side plates down good as well. Though his cowcatchers look a bit slant, but they actually got him down pretty good. I got nothing else to say, he just looks real good. Let's move on. Now I'm also going to go over road characters and coaches too. So let's start with Terence first. Terence looks cool. They got the calipers down nice, though they look a bit small, but the footplate looks about right, so no complaints here. Up next is Bertie. Again, no complaints. Bertie's door is just about right, the front looks good, and the sides is about right too. Good model. Now it's time for the coaches. Let's start with Annie and Clarabel. Now I really couldn't find their real-life counterparts for the Railway series, but to make them look like the Railway series, the TV version looks a lot smaller than the Railway series. So yeah, not the best version. What about Henrietta? She looks a bit better than Annie and Clarabel. They got the model done pretty good for her. No complaints. So those were every single models for the first season. I must say that overall, they look good, but I could understand why the Reverend didn't like some of them, especially after reading the Railway series and learning and looking at their real-life counterparts more. Though some were good, some were meh. I like the models, of course, but that doesn't mean that they had their weak moments too. But overall, they looked good for the most part. Now let's talk about the directing as a whole. David Mitton is a really good director. The shots he makes are great, and it makes the railway look more realistic. Though there were some times where it did seem a bit outdated, like Henry's crash in the Flying Kipper. I'm sure it looked great for people who saw it for the first time, But concerning the later crashes, especially the one in Dirty Objects, it did seem a bit dated. But other than that, I think he's a pretty good director, especially with Thomas and his later stuff. So, good job, David Mitton. Last but not least, it's time for the moment that you want me to talk about. The narrator, Ringo Starr. Now, I won't be talking about George Carlin yet till we get to Season 3, so I could be fair here. Even if people never watched Thomas and Friends, they at least know who the first narrator was. And it's no surprise on why he is well known. Now, to be fair, I never grew up with Ringo's narrations. I had 2 VHS that he narrated, and to be fair here, he's not all that special. Now, it doesn't mean I hate him. There were some episodes I thought he did good, but there were some where he sounded a bit bored. I was used to George Carlin or Alec Baldwin's narration, but like I said, he's not bad. There were some parts where I enjoyed him as a narrator, so overall I thought he was okay for this season. So overall, I give Season 1 an 8 out of 10, a good season. It's easy to see why the show was so popular back then, and why they made more seasons, and why it's still being shown today. It's a shame that there won't be any new Railway series books, but they had a fair run, and if they didn't exist, then we wouldn't have the show as it is today. And yes, I will be reviewing the other seasons as well, and reviewing them the same way I review this season. And I'll also be taking a look at the specials as well. But not only that, I might be doing this for other cartoon shows as well. So if you have a cartoon show you want me to review, let me know and I'll think about it. So thanks for watching this video, and thank you to all my subscribers and viewers out there for watching this 100th episode and my other videos as well. I mean, I've come a bit of a long way since my 2nd year anniversary video. I don't know what I'll be doing for this year, but I do have something planned for next year though. So thanks for watching, and here's hope for some new videos and possibly some new content from this channel. I'll see you all later. Take care.